Hey guys, tonight we begin with a topic the ancient Egyptians took very seriously and sometimes very weirdly: sex. From sacred rituals to surprisingly frank poetry, this civilization was more open, creative, and frankly experimental than most people today might be after 2 glasses of wine and a horoscope reading. Picture this: you're standing in a temple, where the god Min proudly displays his eternal erection, while worshippers offer him lettuce. Yes, lettuce as the ultimate aphrodisiac. Meanwhile, couples are writing steamy love notes on broken pottery shards and planning their sex lives for the afterlife with the same attention to detail that modern people use for vacation planning. Here's your reality check. The ancient Egyptians were having better, more guilt-free, intimate relationships 3,000 years ago than half the people reading dating advice columns today. They treated sexuality like plumbing, necessary, functional, and ideally without too many blockages. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the beginning, there was nothing but endless darkness and the quiet hum of eternity. No light, no land, no breath of wind across empty space, just Atum, the great god, standing alone in the vast emptiness of what would one day become the universe. He looked around at the nothingness that surrounded him and felt something stir deep within his divine essence. Not loneliness, but purpose. A burning need to create, to fill this void with life and meaning. This was ancient Egypt, long before the pyramids rose from desert sands, before pharaohs ruled the Nile, before humans even drew their first breath. In the sacred city of Heliopolis, where the priests would later tell this story with reverence rather than embarrassment, the cosmos awaited its birth. Atum stood at the center of everything and nothing, his powerful form radiating with creative energy that had nowhere to go, no outlet for expression. The great god faced an impossible challenge. How do you create life when you are utterly alone? There was no partner to embrace, no goddess to join him in divine union, no raw materials to shape with his hands, just himself, his will, and his body. But Atum understood something that many later civilizations would forget, that creation itself is an intimate act, that the spark of life comes from the deepest, most personal places within us. What happened next would shock most modern sensibilities, but to the ancient Egyptians, it was the most sacred moment in all of existence. Atum began to pleasure himself, not out of base desire or lustful need, but as a deliberate act of cosmic creation. Every movement was intentional, every sensation a building force of divine will. This wasn't about gratification. This was about Genesis. His hands moved with the rhythm of creation itself, building toward something magnificent and terrible and necessary. The tension grew within the god's divine form, energy coiling and expanding like the universe itself, preparing to explode into existence. Atum's breathing deepened as the creative force within him reached its crescendo. The darkness around him seemed to pulse with anticipation, as if all of nothingness held its breath for what was about to unfold. And then it happened. In a burst of divine ecstasy and cosmic power, Atum reached his climax. From his body flowed the sacred fluids of creation, and from that holy emission came forth Shu, the god of air, and Tefnut, the goddess of moisture. The universe suddenly had breath and wetness, wind and rain, the first building blocks of everything that would ever exist. What had been empty void now stirred with the beginnings of life. Atum stepped back, no longer alone, no longer surrounded by endless nothingness. His children, born of his own sacred pleasure, began their work of creation, Shu spread himself through the darkness, bringing the first winds. Tefnut released the first drops of moisture that would eventually become the life-giving Nile. The cosmos had begun its long journey toward complexity and beauty. The great god looked upon what he had created and felt no shame, no guilt, no need to hide what he had done. In Egyptian understanding, this was the most holy act possible, the transformation of personal energy into universal life. From what many cultures would later condemn as sinful, the Egyptians saw divinity itself. This story would echo through Egyptian civilization for thousands of years, carved into temple walls, whispered in sacred ceremonies, and told to children as a lesson about the power of creation. And perhaps most remarkably, it would establish something that set Egypt apart from almost every other ancient culture. The idea that sexuality wasn't something to be ashamed of, but something to be celebrated as sacred, necessary, and divinely ordained. As Shu and Tefnut began their own work of creation, bringing forth more gods and eventually the world itself, the sacred waters of creation continued to flow through all things, through the Nile that would nourish Egypt, through the bodies of every man and woman who would ever live, through every act of love and creation that would follow. Atum had proven that from the most intimate personal act could come the grandest, most universal gift, life itself. When most women lose their husbands to murder and dismemberment, they grieve, they mourn, they accept their fate, and move on with whatever life remains. But Isis was not most women. She was a goddess with the power to command magic itself. And when her beloved Osiris was brutally killed and his body scattered across Egypt like pieces of a broken vase, she did something that would make her the ultimate symbol of devoted love. She decided to put him back together and make love to him one more time. The kingdom of Egypt had been peaceful under Osiris's gentle rule, a time when the Nile flowed predictably, crops grew abundant, and people lived in harmony with the natural order. But Set, Osiris's younger brother, burned with jealousy so fierce it consumed his divine heart. During a grand feast, Set presented an ornate chest as a gift, claiming it would fit whoever lay inside it perfectly. When Osiris, trusting and unsuspecting, climbed in to test it, Set's followers slammed the lid shut and sealed it with molten lead. Isis felt her husband's death like a dagger through her soul. Set had not only murdered Osiris, but dismembered his body into 14 pieces, scattering them throughout Egypt to ensure he could never return. But Set underestimated the power of a goddess in love. Isis began a journey that would become legend, searching every corner of the land for the fragments of her beloved. Through papyrus swamps and desert valleys, past temple walls and into hidden caves, Isis collected piece by piece the remains of her husband. 13 fragments she found and carefully preserved with magic and tears. But the 14th piece, Osiris's Phallus, had been thrown into the Nile and devoured by fish. The most essential part of her husband's masculinity was gone forever, lost to the hungry waters. Most women would have despaired. Most would have accepted that even divine magic has its limits. But Isis looked at the 13 pieces laid before her and made a decision that would echo through Egyptian mythology for millennia. If the gods had taken away her husband's manhood, then she would create a new one with her own power. Using magic that drew from the deepest wells of divine creativity, Isis crafted a golden phallus, perfect in every detail and blessed with life-giving power. She assembled Osiris's body with the love and precision of a master craftsman, fitting each piece until her husband lay whole before her once again. Then came the moment that would determine the fate of Egypt itself. With incantations that made the air shimmer with power, Isis breathed life back into Osiris's restored form. His eyes opened, his chest rose with breath, and for a brief, precious time, he was truly alive again. In that sacred window between death and eternal rest, Isis climbed atop her resurrected husband, and they made love with a passion that transcended mortality itself. the golden phallus, blessed by divine magic, and Isis's unwavering love, fulfilled its purpose perfectly. In that moment of ultimate intimacy, as Osiris's borrowed life began to fade, Isis conceived. The child growing within her would be Horus, the falcon god who would grow up to avenge his father and reclaim the throne of Egypt from the murderous Set. As Osiris's second death approached, he looked into his wife's eyes with infinite gratitude. Their love had literally conquered death, even if only temporarily. He had given her the gift of their child, and she had given him the gift of continuity, proof that love could create life, even from the ashes of destruction. When Osiris finally departed for the afterlife, he went not as a victim of his brother's jealousy, but as a god who had participated in the creation of his own legacy. Isis, now carrying the future king of Egypt in her womb, had demonstrated something that would become central to Egyptian understanding of both love and divinity, that true devotion knows no boundaries, not even death itself. The sacred waters of the Nile, which had swallowed the original symbol of Osiris's manhood, continued to flow through Egypt, carrying with them the story of a love so powerful it could reshape reality. Every flood season would remind the people that from death comes new life, from loss comes renewal, and from the deepest love comes the most miraculous creation. If a young man in ancient Egypt brought you a bouquet of lettuce, he wasn't thinking about salad. He was making a move that would make modern pickup lines seem quaint by comparison. Those crisp green leaves weren't destined for Caesar dressing. They were an invitation to participate in the most sacred act of creation, blessed by Min, the god whose ethereal erection made even the most confident modern man feel inadequate by comparison. The Temple of Min at Coptos during the Middle Kingdom period was unlike any religious site you might imagine today. Built along the fertile banks of the Nile around 2000 BCE, it served as the epicenter of Egypt's most enthusiastic fertility cult, where thousands of pilgrims gathered annually for festivals that celebrated human sexuality with the same reverence that other cultures reserved for military victories. The air during these celebrations practically hummed with anticipation, hope, and the kind of desperate energy that comes from couples who had been trying to conceive for months without success. Among the crowd of worshippers stood Nebet, a 20-year-old woman whose bright eyes couldn't quite hide the anxiety that had been growing in her heart like a shadow. Beside her, Kenti, her husband of 18 months, carried an armload of the finest lettuce they could afford, tall, crisp stalks that stood upright with the kind of proud bearing that made their symbolic significance impossible to miss. The couple had come to Coptos because their marriage bed, despite regular and enthusiastic attention, had yet to produce the child that both families expected and Egyptian society demanded. The god Min presided over the festivities from his massive stone shrine, depicted with anatomical honesty that would make a modern museum visitor blush. His oversized phallus, carved with impressive attention to detail, was permanently erect and prominently displayed, while his hands held symbols of fertility and regeneration. Most remarkably, Min was always shown grasping stalks of lettuce, not because ancient Egyptians lacked imagination, but because they had observed something that modern botanists would eventually confirm. When cut, lettuce exudes a milky white sap that bears an unmistakable resemblance to another life-giving fluid. The festival reached its crescendo as temple priests distributed sacred lettuce to the assembled couples, explaining that consuming the god's favorite plant would transfer Min's legendary virility to mortal bodies. Nebet and Kenti ate their portions with the solemnity of people taking communion, while around them hundreds of other couples performed the same ritual with varying degrees of faith and desperation. The lettuce was bitter and tough, nothing like the tender varieties we know today, but its supposed magical properties made every difficult bite feel like a prayer made tangible. As night fell and the formal ceremonies concluded, couples dispersed throughout the temple complex and the surrounding groves of date palms, carrying with them not just the lettuce they had consumed, but a renewed sense of divine possibility. Nebet and Kenti found a secluded spot near a small shrine where moonlight filtered through palm fronds, and for the first time in months, their lovemaking felt touched by something beyond mere physical pleasure, a connection to the cosmic forces that had created the Nile's annual floods and the daily journey of the sun across the sky. 9 months later, as the flooding Nile deposited fresh silt across the farmlands around Koptos, Nebet gave birth to a healthy son who would grow up hearing the story of his conception during the Festival of Men. Whether the lettuce had possessed genuine aphrodisiac properties, or whether the psychological impact of participating in a sacred ritual had somehow enhanced the couple's fertility, became irrelevant in the face of their joy. The child thrived, the family celebrated, and lettuce plants in their household garden were tended with the reverence usually reserved for religious relics. The success story spread through their community like ripples across the Nile's surface, inspiring other couples to make their own pilgrimages to Min's temple and adding another layer to the god's reputation for delivering on his promises. The simple act of eating a vegetable had become a bridge between human desire and divine intervention. Proof that in ancient Egypt, even the most mundane plants could carry sacred significance. As Nebet watched her son play in the garden years later, she sometimes smiled at the sight of lettuce growing beside the onions and beans, remembering how those bitter leaves had somehow transformed doubt into hope, desperation into fulfillment. The living water that flowed through every plant, from the mighty sycamores along the riverbank to the humble lettuce in their garden, seemed to carry with it the same life-giving force that flowed through the Nile and through human bodies, connecting all creation in an endless cycle of renewal and regeneration. On a broken piece of pottery, cracked and weathered by 3,000 years, archaeologists found what might be the most romantic text message ever written. Scratched into the clay in hurried hieroglyphs were the words, "I shall lie down at home and pretend to be sick, so that you will come to see me." It was ancient Egypt's version of Netflix and chill, and it worked just as well then as pickup lines do now. The pottery shard came from Thebes during the New Kingdom period, around 1300 BCE, when Egypt was at the height of its power and prosperity. Along the banks of the Nile, in the bustling neighborhoods where artisans and craftsmen lived, love bloomed in the most ordinary circumstances. This particular love story belonged to Amenhotep, a young potter whose hands were always stained with clay, and Nefertiti, not the famous queen, but a local girl who sang at wedding celebrations and had a laugh that could make the Nile itself seem to sparkle. Amenhotep had been watching Nefertiti for months as she walked past his workshop each morning, her voice carrying across the narrow streets as she practiced her songs. She had admirers, plenty of them, young men with better prospects, cleaner hands, and smoother tongues. But none of them understood what Amenhotep saw in the way she paused sometimes mid-song, as if listening to music only she could hear, or how her eyes lit up when children gathered around to listen to her stories. The problem was that Amenhotep, despite his artistic soul, had never been good with words. When Nefertiti passed his shop, he became tongue-tied, managing only awkward nods and nervous smiles. His friends mocked him gently, suggesting he simply walk up and speak to her like a normal person. But in a society where courtship had its rules and expectations, a humble potter couldn't just approach a popular entertainer without some kind of plan. That's when Amenhotep discovered his medium. If he couldn't speak the words, perhaps he could write them. Not on expensive papyrus, which was far beyond his means, but on the broken pottery shards that littered his workshop. What scholars now call ostraca. These pieces of discarded clay became his canvas for the most heartfelt poetry ever scratched into stone. The first message was simple. Your voice is sweeter than honey cakes, and when you sing, the birds stop to listen in shame. He left it where she would find it, tucked into a crack in the wall where she usually paused to rest. The next day, he watched from his workshop as she discovered it, saw her eyes widen as she read the hieroglyphs, saw the smile that spread across her face like sunrise over the Nile. What followed was the ancient world's first text message romance. Nefertiti began leaving her own pottery shards in return. The potter who writes on clay has hands that shape beauty from earth. I wonder what other beautiful things those hands might create. Their correspondence grew bolder, more intimate, as they discovered they could express in writing what they struggled to say aloud. Amenhotep's messages became increasingly creative. I dream of your beauty by night, and my heart beats like a drum when you pass. If I were a bird, I would build my nest where your shadow falls. Nefertiti responded with equal passion. The potter's wheel spins round and round, like my thoughts of you. When will you stop hiding behind your clay and speak to me with your voice? The breakthrough came when Amenhotep wrote his most daring message yet, the pretend illness invitation that archaeologists would find thousands of years later. It was bold, playful, and utterly transparent in its intent. When Nefertiti read it, she laughed so hard that passers-by stopped to see what had delighted her. That evening she appeared at his door with a basket of bread and a knowing smile. I heard you were sick, she said, her eyes dancing with mischief. I've come to nurse you back to health. Their romance became the talk of the neighborhood, not because it was scandalous, but because it was so obviously joyful. They married within the year, and their children grew up hearing the story of how their parents fell in love through poetry written on broken pottery. The sacred waters of the Nile continued to flow past their workshop, carrying with them the echoes of laughter and whispered endearments. Those pottery shards, scattered and forgotten for millennia, preserved something more precious than any royal decree or religious text. They captured the timeless truth that love finds a way to express itself, whether on papyrus, clay, or the human heart itself. Even in death, the ancient Egyptians refused to give up on love. While most civilizations viewed the afterlife as a purely spiritual realm where earthly pleasures became irrelevant, the Egyptians packed their tombs with everything they thought they'd need for eternal romance, including detailed instructions for cosmic lovemaking. Deep within the limestone cliffs of the Valley of the Kings, the tomb of Ramses II and his beloved Queen Nefertari told a story that would make modern couples reconsider their own relationship goals. The walls were covered not just with scenes of religious devotion and royal power, but with intimate portraits of the couple embracing, touching, and gazing into each other's eyes with an affection so genuine it transcended the formal constraints of royal art. But these weren't just sentimental decorations for grieving relatives. According to Egyptian belief, these images served as blueprints for the afterlife, instruction manuals for how the deceased should continue their relationship in the realm beyond death. The Book of the Dead, that famous collection of spells and prayers found in Egyptian tombs, contained passages that modern scholars often skip over in polite academic discussions. Detailed descriptions of how the dead would regain their physical forms, including their capacity for sexual pleasure. The ancient texts were surprisingly explicit about what they expected from eternity. The deceased were promised that their bodies would be restored to perfect condition, that their limbs would function as they had in youth, and that their desires would be fulfilled in ways impossible during mortal life. One spell specifically mentions the restoration of sexual organs, asking gods to ensure that the deceased could know their spouse in the field of reeds, the Egyptian paradise where the blessed dead spent eternity. This wasn't considered crude or inappropriate. It was sacred theology. The Egyptians believed that sexuality was one of the fundamental forces of creation, as essential to the cosmic order as the daily journey of the sun across the sky. Just as Atum had created the universe through his divine self-pleasure, and Isis had conceived Horus through her love for the resurrected Osiris, sexual union was seen as a participation in the ongoing act of creation itself. In the afterlife realm known as the Field of Reeds, Egyptian couples expected to continue their marriages with all the passion and intimacy they had known in life, but without the limitations of mortal flesh. No aging, no illness, no exhaustion. Just eternal love expressed through bodies restored to their prime. The tomb paintings showed couples not as ethereal spirits floating in abstract bliss, but as recognizably human beings who happened to be enjoying perfect health in a perfect world. The practical preparations for afterlife romance were extensive. Tomb goods included cosmetics for maintaining attractiveness, perfumes for seduction, and even beds carved with erotic scenes to ensure the deceased knew how to properly enjoy their restored bodies. Some tombs contained mirrors, jewelry, and fine clothing, everything needed for an eternal honeymoon. The religious texts promised that married couples would recognize each other immediately upon reaching the afterlife, that their love would be even stronger than it had been on earth, and that they would have eternity to explore the depths of their connection. Death was viewed not as an ending of romance, but as its ultimate fulfillment, the moment when love could finally be expressed without any physical or temporal constraints. Even the gods themselves provided the model for this eternal romance. Osiris and Isis continued their marriage in the underworld, where Osiris ruled as king of the dead, while Isis remained his devoted queen. Their love story, which began with resurrection and magical conception, continued beyond death as an example of how true devotion transcends mortality. As the sacred waters of the Nile flowed past the tombs of countless couples, they carried with them the hopes and dreams of lovers who refused to believe that death could part them. The river that had nourished their lives would continue to flow in the afterlife, where they would walk hand in hand along its banks, young again, beautiful again, and finally free to love without fear of loss. This eternal optimism about Lot's persistence became one of ancient Egypt's most enduring legacies. They had looked at the fundamental fact of human mortality and decided, with characteristic determination, that it simply wasn't going to interfere with their relationships. In a civilization that could build pyramids to last forever, why shouldn't love last just as long? President James Madison stood on the north balcony of the Executive Mansion, squinting into the summer haze of 1812, and allowed himself a satisfied smile. Below him, the young capital city of Washington sprawled along the Potomac River, like a teenager still growing into its limbs, unfinished, ambitious, and utterly convinced of its own invincibility. At barely 22 years old, the city had survived its awkward childhood and was ready to prove itself on the world stage. Madison, all 5 feet 4 inches of him, felt equally confident about America's prospects in the war he had just declared against the British Empire. The decision to go to war had not been taken lightly, though hindsight would suggest otherwise. For years, British naval forces had been stopping American merchant ships, kidnapping American sailors, and treating the young republic like a rebellious child who needed constant discipline. The practice of impressment, forcing American sailors into British naval service, had pushed national pride beyond its breaking point. Add to that British support for Native American raids on the frontier, and war seemed not just justified, but inevitable. From his perch above the muddy streets of Washington, Madison surveyed a capital that embodied America's supreme confidence. The city had been carved from Maryland's swampland barely 2 decades earlier, a compromise location that satisfied neither North nor South, but somehow managed to symbolize the democratic experiment itself. The Capitol building rose from Jenkins Hill with its distinctive dome still under construction, while the president's house stood pristine white against the green Virginia hills across the river. Dolly Madison, the president's vivacious wife, had transformed the executive mansion into a salon that rivaled anything in European capitals. Her Wednesday evening receptions drew diplomats, congressmen, and society figures who marveled at the young nation's sophistication. The mansion's East Room hosted elegant dinners where American democracy showed off its best manners, while the Blue Room displayed Gilbert Stuart's magnificent portrait of George Washington, a reminder that this upstart republic had already defeated the British once. Secretary of War John Armstrong, Jr. shared Madison's optimism with even less justification. A tall, arrogant man who had served as minister to France, Armstrong possessed the kind of supreme confidence that comes from never having been seriously tested. He assured Madison that Britain, exhausted from its long war with Napoleon, could barely spare the resources to defend Canada, let alone mount any serious assault on American territory. "They'll concentrate on Baltimore if they attack anywhere," Armstrong insisted repeatedly, dismissing suggestions that the capital itself might be vulnerable. The American military plan seemed foolproof in its simplicity: invade Canada while Britain was distracted by the European war, seize British territory as a bargaining chip, and force London to respect American sovereignty on the high seas. The invasion would be swift. The Canadian population would welcome their American liberators, and Britain would have no choice but to negotiate from a position of weakness. This strategic thinking ignored several inconvenient realities. The attempted invasion of Canada had already failed spectacularly, with American forces suffering humiliating defeats at Detroit and along the Niagara frontier. The few naval victories that American commanders had managed to achieve on the Great Lakes were hardly enough to offset the disasters on land. Meanwhile, political divisions within the United States made effective prosecution of the war nearly impossible, with New England states openly opposing the conflict and threatening to make separate peace with Britain. Most dangerously, the grand strategy depended entirely on Napoleon's continued success in Europe. As long as the French emperor kept Britain's attention focused on continental warfare, America could operate with relative impunity in its own hemisphere. But whispers had begun reaching Washington about setbacks in Russia, about coalitions forming against French power, about the possibility that Britain might soon have veteran troops available for deployment elsewhere. Madison dismissed these concerns with the casual wave of a man who had never faced serious military opposition. Standing on his balcony, as twilight settled over the Capitol, he watched the lamplighters beginning their evening rounds and felt nothing but confidence in America's destiny. The flickering flames that would soon illuminate the city's streets seemed like symbols of enlightenment itself, proof that the democratic experiment was not just surviving, but thriving. The small candle flames dancing in the mansion's windows cast a warm glow across the presidential family's private quarters, where maps of Canada lay spread across mahogany tables and victory seemed inevitable. Those same gentle flames would soon have terrible company, but on this peaceful evening in 1812, they represented nothing more threatening than domestic tranquility and national pride. Major General Robert Ross stepped off the British transport ship onto the muddy banks of the Patuxent River at Benedict, Maryland, and immediately sensed something was wrong. After years of brutal fighting against Napoleon's armies across Europe, where every mile was contested with blood and artillery, this felt suspiciously like a pleasant country walk. His 4,500 veteran troops, hardened by campaigns from Spain to Waterloo, spread out along the riverbank with the efficient precision of professional soldiers, and found absolutely no one shooting at them. "Where exactly is the American army?" Ross asked his aide, scanning the peaceful Maryland countryside that stretched before them like an open invitation. Intelligence reports had suggested that Washington's defenses were light, but this was beyond optimistic. It was surreal. The British had landed the largest foreign invasion force on American soil since the Revolution, and the response appeared to be a collective shrug from the local population. The march toward Washington began on August 19, 1814, and quickly took on the character of an armed parade rather than a military campaign. Ross's columns advanced along dusty country roads, past abandoned farmhouses and empty fields, meeting no organized resistance whatsoever. Occasionally, a few local militia would fire a scattered volley from the tree line before melting away into the forest. But these half-hearted gestures only emphasized how utterly unprepared the Americans were for serious warfare. Brigadier General William Winder, the American commander tasked with defending the nation's capital, was living proof that political connections matter more than military competence. A Baltimore lawyer whose main qualification for command was his relationship to the governor of Maryland, Winder had spent the past several days riding frantically around the countryside, issuing contradictory orders and changing defensive plans with dizzying frequency. His forces, such as they were, consisted mainly of hastily assembled militia units whose training ranged from minimal to non-existent. While Ross's veterans covered ground with the steady rhythm of experienced campaigners, Winder's Americans stumbled through a comedy of errors that would have been funny if the stakes weren't so high. Units marched in circles, supplies went missing, and crucial intelligence about British movements arrived hours or days late. The few professional soldiers available were scattered across multiple positions, diluting their effectiveness and leaving no concentrated force capable of mounting serious resistance. The British advance became a study in military professionalism versus amateur enthusiasm. Ross maintained strict discipline among his troops, prohibiting looting and ensuring that civilians were treated with respect. His men moved in tight formations, established proper camps each evening, and maintained communications with their naval support. Every aspect of their operation demonstrated the difference between veterans who had faced the Grande Armée and militia who had never seen combat. American attempts at resistance collapsed before they could properly begin. At Upper Marlborough, Winder finally managed to assemble a significant force, only to order another retreat before the British even arrived. Local commanders watched in frustration as opportunities to harass the invaders slipped away due to indecision and poor coordination. The few skirmishes that did occur ended with American forces breaking contact and falling back, leaving the road to Washington increasingly clear. As news of the British advance reached the capital, panic began to set in among government officials who had spent 2 years assuring themselves that such an attack was impossible. Secretary of War Armstrong continued to insist that Baltimore was the real target, despite mounting evidence that Ross was heading straight for Washington. President Madison, finally grasping the magnitude of the threat, rode out to personally observe the situation and was horrified by what he found. On August 24th, the two forces finally met at Bladensburg, a small town just northeast of Washington. What followed would be remembered as the Bladensburg races. Though the only racing involved was American militia running away from the battlefield. Despite outnumbering the British, the American force collapsed within hours as units broke and fled without maintaining organized resistance. Ross stood on the field at Bladensburg, watching the last American stragglers disappear into the distance, and shook his head in amazement. The road to Washington lay completely open, defended by nothing more than the summer heat and a few bewildered government clerks. As his tired but victorious columns reformed for the final approach to the Capitol, small flames seemed to dance in the humid air. Mirages from the heat, perhaps, or an omen of what was about to unfold in the seat of American democracy. Dolly Madison stood before her dressing mirror in the president's house for what she sensed might be the last time. Carefully arranging her hair with the same attention to detail that had made her Washington's most celebrated hostess. Outside, the sounds of a city in panic echoed through the elegant rooms, carriages rattling away at desperate speed, voices shouting contradictory orders, the general chaos of a government abandoning its seat of power. But Dolly refused to be rushed. If she was going to flee the capital, she would do so with dignity intact and the nation's treasure safely in her hands. The afternoon of August 24th, 1814, had arrived with deceptive normalcy. Dolly had set the table for dinner as usual, expecting her husband to return from his disastrous reconnaissance mission to Bladensburg with news that the British had been repelled. Instead, messengers brought increasingly frantic reports. The American army had collapsed, President Madison was fleeing for his life, and British troops were marching toward Washington with no one left to stop them. Most women in her position would have panicked, grabbed a few personal belongings, and run. But Dolly Madison had spent 8 years as America's unofficial queen, transforming the president's house into a symbol of democratic elegance that rivaled European palaces. She had hosted senators and diplomats, foreign ministers, and Supreme Court justices, creating a social atmosphere that proved the young republic could match old-world sophistication. She was not about to let the British destroy that legacy without a fight. Working alongside Paul Jennings, one of the household's enslaved servants, who showed remarkable courage in staying to help, Dolly began the desperate task of saving what could be saved. Her first priority was Gilbert Stuart's full-length portrait of George Washington, the iconic image that had become the visual symbol of American independence. The painting was screwed to the wall in the state dining room, and the frame proved too large and heavy to remove quickly. "Break the frame," Dolly ordered, her voice steady despite the approaching danger. "Save the canvas at all costs." Paul Jennings and the gardener used knives to cut the portrait from its frame, carefully rolling the canvas to prevent damage. This single painting represented more than art. It was the face of the revolution, the visual reminder that America had defeated British power before and would survive to do so again. Meanwhile, Dolly methodically packed the most precious items she could carry: important state papers, silver serving pieces that had graced diplomatic dinners, and the red velvet curtains from the Oval Room that had witnessed countless historic conversations. Every item she selected had symbolic as well as practical value, pieces of American dignity that the British would not be allowed to destroy or capture. As British troops entered the outskirts of Washington, an eerie calm settled over the abandoned capital. Government buildings stood empty, their doors unlocked and papers scattered by fleeing bureaucrats. The British soldiers, disciplined veterans despite their fatigue, marched through streets so quiet they could hear their own footsteps echoing off the buildings. Admiral George Cockburn, who had spent years nursing a personal grudge against America for unflattering newspaper cartoons, led the advance party into the city center with obvious relish. When his men reached the president's house, they found the dinner table still set with fine china and crystal, the food still warm in serving dishes. In a gesture that perfectly captured the surreal nature of the moment, Cockburn and his officers sat down and ate President Madison's dinner while discussing which buildings to burn first. The torch lighting began as twilight approached. The Capitol building, symbol of American democracy, was first to feel the flames. British soldiers used furniture and books from the Congressional Library as kindling, turning the halls where American laws were debated into an inferno that could be seen for miles. The Treasury building followed, then the War Department, each blaze adding to a growing pyre of American governmental authority. When flames finally reached the president's house, they consumed 8 years of Dolly Madison's careful cultivation of American dignity. The elegant blue room, where she had hosted diplomatic receptions, the state dining room, where foreign ministers had been impressed by Republican sophistication, the private quarters, where the first family had lived, all of it fed the hungry fire that turned Washington's most famous address into a blackened shell. As midnight approached and the fires reached their peak intensity, Washington looked less like a capital city than like a vision of hell. Orange flames danced against the night sky, casting writhing shadows on empty streets where American democracy had once strutted with confident pride. The flickering light that had once represented enlightenment and progress now embodied destruction and national humiliation, dancing in triumph over the ruins of Republican ambition. Major General Robert Ross stood in the ruins of what had been the president's house, watching flames dance through the shattered windows with the satisfaction of a job well done. Around him, his officers discussed which targets to burn next, perhaps the patent office or the remaining government warehouses along the Potomac. The night air was thick with smoke and the acrid smell of burning timber. But the British general felt nothing but professional pride in the thoroughness of his men's work. Then the wind began to change. At first, it was just a cooling breeze that offered welcome relief from the oppressive August heat and the furnace-like atmosphere created by the burning buildings. Ross loosened his collar and noted how the wind was helping to spread the flames more efficiently through the government quarter. But within minutes, that gentle breeze had become something altogether more ominous, a driving force that bent trees nearly horizontal and sent debris flying through the air like artillery shells. The sky, which had been clear and star-filled despite the smoke, suddenly darkened as if a great curtain had been drawn across the heavens. Clouds appeared from nowhere, boiling up from the horizon with supernatural speed and blotting out the moon. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in as many minutes, and the wind began to howl with a voice that seemed almost human in its fury. Then came the rain. Not the gentle summer shower that might have been expected in Virginia's humid climate, but a torrential downpour that fell as if someone had turned the Potomac River upside down and dumped it from the sky. British soldiers who had been methodically setting fires found themselves drenched to the skin within seconds, their torches extinguished and their carefully planned arson disrupted by nature's sudden intervention. But this was only the beginning. As Ross and his men sought shelter in the few buildings still standing, the storm intensified beyond anything in their military experience. Lightning split the sky with such frequency that night became a strobe-lit nightmare of blazing white and absolute black. Thunder crashed with such violence that veteran soldiers who had stood firm under Napoleon's artillery found themselves flinching and covering their ears. The wind reached hurricane force, picking up debris from the burning buildings and hurling it through the air like projectiles. A British soldier standing near the Treasury building was struck by a flying beam and killed instantly, the first casualty of what was beginning to feel less like weather and more like divine retribution. Cannons that had been positioned for the defense of Washington were picked up by the wind and tossed aside like toys. Then, impossibly, came the tornado, rising from the chaos of the storm like a finger of God, pointing directly at the heart of the burning capital. A massive funnel cloud touched down in the center of Washington and began to tear a path of destruction through the city. Houses that had survived the British torches were ripped from their foundations and scattered like matchsticks. Trees that had stood for decades were uprooted and flung hundreds of yards. The tornado's path led directly through the government quarter where Ross's men had been working. British soldiers ran for their lives as the whirling column of destruction approached, abandoning their orderly military formation for the basic human instinct of survival. The wind was so powerful that it extinguished many of the fires they had set, while simultaneously destroying buildings they had planned to burn in a much more spectacular fashion. Ross himself took shelter in a partially collapsed building and watched in amazement as the storm raged around him. This was not normal weather. This was something beyond the experience of a man who had campaigned from the peninsula to Waterloo. His soldiers, many of whom were deeply religious despite their profession, began to whisper that this was God's judgment on their mission, divine intervention to protect the American capital. As quickly as it had come, the storm began to subside. The tornado dissipated, the wind died to a whisper, and the rain gradually slowed from a deluge to a drizzle. In the sudden quiet that followed, Ross emerged from his shelter to survey a scene of devastation that exceeded anything his army had accomplished. The storm had done more damage to Washington in 2 hours than the British had managed in 2 days. Many of the fires had been extinguished by the rain, while others had been disrupted by flying debris. The carefully planned destruction of the American capital had been interrupted by forces beyond human control. Looking around at his soaked and shaken troops, Ross made a decision that would puzzle military historians for generations. He ordered the immediate withdrawal of British forces from Washington. The flames that had danced so triumphantly through the ruins of American democracy now flickered weakly in the dampened air, like candles guttering in the wind. Nature had reclaimed the night, and with it, perhaps, had preserved something essential about the city that would rise from these ashes. James Madison stood in what had been the east room of the president's house, his boots crunching on broken glass and charred debris, and gripped his wife's hand with a determination that surprised even him. Around them stretched the blackened skeleton of what had been America's most elegant residence, its walls smoke-stained and its windows empty holes, staring out at a capital that looked like the aftermath of biblical judgment. But Madison, barely 5 feet tall and often dismissed as an ineffectual intellectual, found himself saying words that would define his presidency. "We will rebuild, and this time it will be stronger." The autumn of 1814 brought with it a fierce debate that threatened to finish what the British had started. Congressmen from New York and Philadelphia argued passionately that Washington should be abandoned as the national capital, pointing out that the swampy, half-finished city had proven impossible to defend and was an obvious target for future attacks. Why not move the government to an established city with real fortifications and a genuine commercial base? For weeks, it seemed the Republic might scatter its institutions across multiple cities, fragmenting the symbolic unity that Washington represented. The temporary Capitol building where Congress met was a constant reminder of how precarious American democracy had become. Representatives conducted the nation's business, surrounded by the smell of smoke and the sound of hammers, as workmen tried to repair the most basic government functions. But Dolly Madison had become something more powerful than a president's wife. She had become a symbol of American resilience. Her dramatic rescue of George Washington's portrait had captured the public imagination in ways that military victories could not. Stories spread across the country of how she had remained calm under fire, how she had prioritized national treasures over personal safety, how she had shown the kind of grace under pressure that seemed to embody the best of American character. The reconstruction effort began slowly, hampered by shortages of money, materials, and skilled craftsmen. But something remarkable happened as work progressed. Ordinary citizens began contributing not just money, but labor. Stonemasons from Virginia, carpenters from Maryland, and laborers from across the region arrived in Washington offering their services. What had started as a government rebuilding project became a community effort that transcended class and regional boundaries. Benjamin Henry Latrobe, the architect overseeing the reconstruction, designed improvements that would make the new buildings both more beautiful and more secure. The president's house would be rebuilt with stronger foundations and better fireproof construction. The Capitol would rise again with a grander dome and more impressive chambers. These were not just repairs, they were statements that America intended to be more magnificent after its defeat than it had been before. The most symbolic moment came when workers began painting the reconstructed executive mansion. To cover the smoke stains and burn marks that marred its sandstone walls, they applied coat after coat of white paint until the building gleamed like fresh snow against the Virginia hills. The residence had always been called the President's House or the Executive Mansion, but now it became known by the name that would stick forever, the White House. That gleaming white facade became more than architectural necessity. It became a declaration. Every visitor to the Capitol could see from miles away that America had not just survived its humiliation, but had emerged from it more beautiful than before. The building that had been reduced to a blackened shell now stood as a symbol of resurrection and renewal. Congress ultimately voted to remain in Washington, but the decision was about more than geography. It was about refusing to let temporary defeat become permanent retreat. The legislators who had fled in panic during the British attack now returned to declare that American democracy would not be driven from the city created specifically to house it. President Madison's second inaugural address took place not in the restored Capitol, which was still under construction, but in the temporary quarters that had become known as the Old Brick Capitol. His words were simple but resolute. The strength of a republic lies not in its buildings, but in its people. We have lost structures of wood and stone, but we have gained something more valuable, the knowledge that we can endure, and we can rebuild. As spring arrived in 1815, Washington began to look like a capital city again. The White House gleamed in the morning sun, its windows catching and reflecting light that seemed to dance with new hope. Those flickering flames that had once represented destruction had been replaced by something steadier and more enduring. The bright, constant light of a democracy that had looked into the abyss and chosen to build bridges across it instead of falling in. Margaret de Clare stood before the altar of Pembroke Castle's chapel, her 13-year-old hands trembling as she clutched a bouquet of autumn roses, and tried not to think about her mother's grave in the castle courtyard. Lady Eleanor had died 18 months earlier at 28, worn down by 6 pregnancies and 4 living children. And Margaret knew with the terrible clarity that comes to those who mature too quickly that she was likely following the same path to an early death. The year was 1295, and marriage at 13 was not just common among the Welsh nobility. It was expected, necessary, and completely indifferent to the wishes of the children involved. Margaret's betrothal to Lord Edmund of Lancaster had been arranged when she was 9, a political alliance designed to secure her family's holdings against Scottish raiders and strengthen ties with the English crown. The fact that Edmund was 35, had already buried 2 wives, and needed an heir with desperate urgency was considered advantageous rather than alarming. The great hall of Pembroke Castle buzzed with the subdued celebration that marked medieval weddings, more business transaction than romantic ceremony. Lords and ladies dressed in their finest wool and silk discussed grain harvests and border disputes, while consuming vast quantities of wine and roasted meat. The bride was an afterthought in her own wedding, a pretty child whose primary function was to provide male heirs for a political alliance none of the adults expected her to survive. Margaret had spent the morning with her aunt, Lady Gwenllian, receiving final instructions about her wifely duties. that were delivered with the clinical detachment of a military briefing. The mechanics of conception were explained in terms that made the act sound both mystical and terrifying, while the realities of pregnancy and childbirth were discussed with the same matter-of-fact acceptance that medieval people brought to plague and warfare. Inevitable calamities that killed some people and spared others according to God's mysterious will. Lord Edmund waited at the altar with the patience of a man who had done this before and expected to do it again if necessity demanded. He was not cruel, merely practical, a seasoned warrior who needed legitimate heirs to secure his lands and had no time for sentiment in a world where political alliances shifted like weather patterns. Margaret represented breeding stock of excellent quality, noble bloodline, substantial dowry, and a family history of producing sons who survived to adulthood. The ceremony itself lasted barely 20 minutes, conducted in Latin that neither bride nor groom fully understood, by a priest who had performed hundreds of similar transactions. Margaret's "I do" was spoken in a voice so quiet that witnesses strained to hear it, while Edmund's response boomed through the stone chapel with the confidence of a man claiming a prize he had purchased fairly. When the priest pronounced them husband and wife, Margaret felt less like a bride than like a commodity that had just changed ownership. The wedding feast that followed lasted until well past midnight, but Margaret was excused after the formal toasts to prepare for her wedding night. In her new chambers, larger and more elegant than her childhood rooms but somehow more frightening, she was undressed by servants who spoke in whispers and moved with the efficiency of people who had done this many times before. The silk chemise they dressed her in was beautiful, expensive, and utterly inadequate protection against what was about to happen. When Edmund finally arrived in the matrimonial chamber, he was courteous but businesslike. He had no interest in romance or seduction. His goal was conception, and he approached it with the methodical determination of a military campaign. Margaret lay perfectly still throughout the encounter, as she had been instructed, and tried to focus on her prayers rather than the pain and indignity of what medieval society considered her most important contribution to the world. Afterward, as Edmund returned to his own chambers and Margaret lay alone with blood staining the sheets that would be examined by servants in the morning as proof of her virginity, she understood that her childhood had ended not with the wedding ceremony, but with this moment. At 13, she was now a wife, whose primary responsibility was to survive pregnancy and childbirth long enough to produce the sons that would justify her existence. 2 months later, when the familiar signs confirmed that she had conceived immediately, Margaret placed her hand on her still flat stomach and whispered a prayer that was part gratitude and part terror. She had succeeded in her first duty as a wife, but she also knew that each drop of blood in her young body might be needed for the struggle ahead, the ancient, deadly battle between life and death that medieval women fought in birthing chambers, with no weapons except courage and an occasional midwife's questionable wisdom. Agnes Miller woke in the pre-dawn darkness of her Yorkshire cottage to a sound that every medieval mother dreaded: the absence of sound. Little Thomas, her 3-year-old son, who had been coughing and burning with fever for 5 days, had finally stopped his restless whimpering. In the terrible silence that filled their one-room home, Agnes knew with the intuition that comes to mothers who have already buried 2 children that death had come calling again. The winter of 1348 had been brutal, even by medieval standards, bringing not just killing cold and failed harvests, but the creeping shadow of the Black Death that was slowly devouring Europe village by village. Agnes had hoped that their remote Yorkshire settlement might escape the plague's notice, but disease traveled with merchants and pilgrims, and even the most isolated communities found themselves touched by the skeletal fingers of pandemic death. Thomas lay perfectly still in the straw bed he shared with his mother and 5 siblings, his small face peaceful in a way that broke Agnes's heart. During his illness, she had tried everything that medieval medicine and maternal desperation could devise. Herbal teas, brewed from plants gathered in the forest, prayers whispered over his burning forehead, and even a pilgrimage to the local shrine of St. Margaret, carrying the boy on her back when he became too weak to walk. Will Miller, Agnes's husband, had offered no help beyond occasional drunken suggestions that they accept God's will and stop wasting time on lost causes. His response to family crisis was to disappear into the village alehouse and return home stumbling and useless, leading Agnes to face the nightmare of watching her children die with no support except her own exhausted strength and the occasional sympathy of neighbor women who were fighting similar battles in their own homes. The cottage where Agnes raised her family was typical of medieval peasant housing. A single room with dirt floors, walls of wattle and daub that let in winter drafts, and a central fire pit that filled the space with smoke but provided little warmth. Privacy was impossible, sanitation was primitive, and disease spread through families like wildfire through dry grass. When one child fell sick, mothers could only pray that the others would be spared, while knowing that hope was usually futile. As the other children began to stir with the approaching dawn, Agnes gathered Thomas's small body in her arms and carried him outside to the vegetable garden behind their cottage. The ground was frozen too hard for digging, but she had no choice except to wrap him in the only clean cloth she possessed and place him in the root cellar until the earth softened enough for burial. There would be no funeral, no priest, no ceremony, just a mother's private grief and the practical necessity of protecting the living from further contagion. Throughout that terrible day, Agnes continued her normal routine of tending the fire, preparing thin gruel for the surviving children, and mending clothes that would soon be passed down to smaller siblings if they lived long enough to wear them. Medieval peasant women had no time for prolonged mourning. The work of survival demanded attention even in the depths of personal tragedy. Grief was a luxury that could be indulged only after the basic necessities of life had been secured. But even as she went through the motions of daily life, Agnes felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. Thomas had been her middle child, bright and curious despite their poverty, the one who helped her carry water from the well and always shared his meager portions with younger siblings. His death represented not just personal loss, but the cruel mathematics of medieval motherhood, the knowledge that loving deeply meant accepting that most of that love would end in premature graves. By evening, young Mary was showing the same symptoms that had marked the beginning of Thomas's illness. Agnes held her 4-year-old daughter close to the fire and tried not to calculate how many children she might lose before spring arrived. Medieval mothers developed a kind of emotional armor that allowed them to function during multiple tragedies, but that armor came at a cost, the gradual hardening of hearts that had been broken too many times. As night fell and the cottage filled with the sound of coughing from multiple small bodies, Agnes knelt beside the fire and whispered prayers that had become as familiar as breathing. She prayed for her children's recovery, for her own strength to endure whatever came next, and for the kind of acceptance that would allow her to keep loving in the face of certain loss. The firelight danced across her tear-stained face like drops of blood, tears that she allowed herself to shed only in the darkness, when her surviving children couldn't see their mother's despair and lose what little hope they had left. Eleanor of Aquitaine stood at the tall windows of Winchester Castle, watching her 10-year-old son Henry practice sword play in the courtyard below, and felt the familiar twist of anxiety that had become her constant companion since bearing 8 children into a world where royal blood made you a target rather than offering protection. At 62, she had outlived 2 husbands, survived imprisonment by one of them, and buried more children than any mother should have to endure. Yet the sight of young Henry wielding a sword still made her heart race with maternal terror disguised as political calculation. The year was 1184, and Eleanor ruled England as regent while her son Richard campaigned in France. But her real power came from something far more complex than political authority. She was the mother of kings, the woman whose womb had produced the heirs who would shape Europe for generations. Yet this honor came with burdens that ordinary mothers could never comprehend. Every pregnancy was a matter of international diplomacy, every birth announced by messengers to foreign courts, and every childhood illness monitored by enemies who hoped for succession crises. Prince Henry, her eldest surviving son and heir to the English throne, possessed the kind of quick intelligence and natural leadership that made him his father's favorite and his mother's greatest worry. In medieval royal families, talented children attracted both opportunity and danger. They became chess pieces in games played by adults who viewed assassination and kidnapping as routine political tools. Eleanor had learned to see potential threats in every courtier's smile and every visiting dignitary's interest in her children's activities. The demands of royal motherhood had forced Eleanor to make choices that haunted her conscience daily. When young Geoffrey was 7, she had been compelled to send him as a hostage to the French court to secure a peace treaty, knowing she might never see him again. When her daughter Matilda reached marriageable age at 11, Eleanor had personally negotiated her betrothal to Henry the Lion of Saxony, trading her child's happiness for political alliance with Germanic kingdoms that could provide military support against French aggression. Eleanor's own childhood had taught her that royal women were valuable primarily as breeding stock and diplomatic bargaining chips. But her intelligence and force of personality had allowed her to transcend those limitations and wield real power. Still, every decision she made as a mother was filtered through political calculation. Which children should be educated for rule? Which should be married for alliances? And which should enter the church to secure spiritual protection for the family dynasty? The loss of Prince William at age 3 had nearly destroyed her. Not because she loved him more than her other children, but because his death represented the failure of her most fundamental duty as a queen: to provide backup heirs in case of disaster. Medieval royal families practiced what amounted to strategic overbreeding, producing as many children as possible because disease, accident, and political violence made every succession uncertain. Eleanor had learned to love her children fiercely while simultaneously preparing for their loss. Managing the education and marriages of 8 children across a European empire required diplomatic skills that rivaled those of professional ambassadors. Eleanor corresponded with popes and emperors about her children's futures, negotiated dowries that could bankrupt kingdoms, and arranged marriages that would either secure peace or trigger wars, depending on how carefully the contracts were written. Her maternal instincts had to be constantly balanced against dynastic necessities that might require sacrificing individual happiness for collective survival. The court at Winchester buzzed with rumors about which of Eleanor's sons would ultimately inherit England, France, and the vast Angevin territories that stretched from Scotland to the Pyrenees. Henry was the designated heir, but Richard showed greater military promise, while Geoffrey possessed political cunning that might serve him better than martial prowess. Eleanor loved all three differently but equally, yet she knew that their rivalry might ultimately destroy the family she had sacrificed everything to create. As she watched Henry complete his sword exercises and walk toward the castle with the confident stride of a future king, Eleanor whispered a prayer that had become as familiar as breathing, that she would live long enough to see her children safely established in their inheritances, that the enemies circling her family would find other targets, and that the boys she had carried in her womb would remember their mother's love, even when political necessity forced them to become strangers to each other. The afternoon light streaming through the castle windows caught the tears she refused to let fall, drops of maternal anguish that glittered like blood in the golden air, precious and dangerous in equal measure. Joan de Montfort heard the sound of approaching hoofbeats and knew with the sick certainty that comes to mothers in wartime that they had come for her son. From the narrow window of her manor house in Brittany, she watched 3 knights in mail and surcoats ride up the muddy path, their horses breathing steam in the cold morning air of 1337. 7-year-old Pierre was playing with wooden soldiers by the fire, completely unaware that his childhood was about to end as abruptly as if someone had blown out a candle. The 100 Years' War had begun with all the pageantry that medieval nobility loved. Banners flying, trumpets sounding, and grand speeches about honor and duty. But for mothers like Joan, whose husbands owed military service to their lords, war meant something much simpler and more terrible. It meant watching their sons disappear into a system that would either make them warriors or kill them, with very little middle ground between those outcomes. Sir Guillaume de Clisson, the knight who had come to collect Pierre, was not cruel by medieval standards, merely practical. The feudal system that governed their world required that boys from noble families begin their military training as pages around age 7, learning to serve knights, while gradually acquiring the skills they would need to become warriors themselves. It was an honor to be selected for such service, a sign that Pierre's bloodline and potential had been recognized by men who understood the business of war. Joan had known this day would come since Pierre's birth, had even taken pride in his quick intelligence and natural courage that made him an obvious candidate for knightly training. But knowing something intellectually and feeling it emotionally were entirely different experiences. As she looked at her son's small hands manipulating his toy soldiers, she wondered if he understood that real warfare meant watching friends die, meant killing other mothers' sons, meant learning to function normally while surrounded by violence and death. Medieval mothers lived with a contradiction that would drive modern parents insane. They were expected to raise their sons to be gentle and courteous in the household, while simultaneously preparing them for lives of sanctified brutality on the battlefield. Pierre had learned to say his prayers, to show respect for women and clergy, and to share his food with the poor. He had also learned to handle a small sword, to ride without stirrups, and to endure pain without crying. At 7, he was considered ready for the intermediate stage of his education in violence. The farewell scene played out with the ritualized dignity that medieval society imposed on even its most heartbreaking moments. Pierre knelt before his mother to receive her blessing, while Joan placed her hands on his small head and spoke the traditional words about honor, duty, and service to God and King. Neither of them was allowed to cry or cling or acknowledge that this might be the last time they would ever touch each other. Sir Guillaume had brought appropriate gifts to mark the occasion: a real sword, sized for a child's hand, a cloak bearing his family's heraldic colors, and a letter of introduction to the lord who would oversee Pierre's training. These items transformed Pierre from a child playing with toys into a young warrior beginning his apprenticeship in the most deadly profession medieval society could offer. As the three knights rode away with Pierre, mounted on a pony behind Sir Guillaume, Joan stood at her window and watched until they disappeared into the forest that marked the edge of her world. She would never see her son again, though she would hear stories over the years that he had shown promise as a fighter, that he had been wounded in a skirmish with brigands, that he had died bravely in his first real battle at age 15 while trying to rescue a fallen comrade. The room where Pierre had played seemed impossibly quiet after his departure. His wooden soldiers lay scattered on the floor exactly where he had left them. Tiny carved figures that would never move again unless Joan picked them up herself. She left them there for 3 days, unable to bear the finality of putting away the last evidence of her son's childhood, before finally gathering them with hands that shook like autumn leaves. Medieval warfare consumed boys with the same methodical efficiency that it consumed everything else, and mothers were expected to contribute their sons to this machinery of violence with the same patriotic enthusiasm that their husbands showed when marching off to campaign. Joan had done her duty, raised a son worthy of knightly service, and delivered him to the system that would either make him a hero or a corpse. The drops of tears that fell on the wooden soldiers were the only rebellion she allowed herself. Salt water that tasted like blood, like loss, like the price that mothers pay for the honor of bearing sons in a world where honor is measured by willingness to die. In a forgotten cemetery outside a village that no longer exists, archaeologists found something that made them stop their careful excavation and stare in wonder. Wrapped in decaying linen and tucked beneath the bones of a woman who had died 700 years ago was a piece of parchment with words scratched in medieval Latin. For my beloved child, if you read this, know that your mother loved you more than life itself, more than salvation, more than the promise of heaven. The discovery was part of a broader revelation that had been slowly emerging from medieval dig sites across Europe. Evidence that the mothers history forgot had found ways to speak across centuries, leaving traces of their love embedded in graves, carved into church walls, and hidden in the margins of manuscripts where scribes thought no one would look. These women, whose names never appeared in chronicles or royal genealogies, had created their own immortality through the simple act of refusing to let their children be forgotten. Dr. Sarah Mitchell, the lead archaeologist on the project, had spent her career studying medieval burial practices, but nothing had prepared her for the emotional impact of finding these maternal messages. We're not just uncovering bones and artifacts, she explained to her graduate students as they carefully cataloged another find, a child's shoe buried with its mother, still containing a scroll with lullaby lyrics written in fading ink. We're discovering that love leaves archaeological evidence. The pattern repeated across dozens of sites. mothers who had died in childbirth with blessing prayers sewn into their burial clothes, grandmothers interred with recipe collections written on scraps of leather for daughters they would never see again, and peasant women whose graves contained the only toys their children had ever owned. These were wealthy nobles who could commission elaborate tomb sculptures. These were ordinary women who had found extraordinary ways to ensure their maternal love would survive their deaths. One of the most moving discoveries came from a plague cemetery in what had once been a thriving market town. Among the mass graves where entire families had been buried during the Black Death, researchers found a woman clutched around a bundle that proved to contain not treasure or religious artifacts, but children's clothing and a wooden doll. Analysis revealed that the woman had died holding items that belonged to children who had predeceased her. A mother who had chosen to take her lost baby's possessions into eternity rather than leave them behind for strangers. The genetic analysis told stories that complemented the archaeological evidence. DNA extracted from medieval remains revealed family connections that spanned generations, showing how traits passed from mother to child across centuries of plague, famine, and war. Every person alive today who can trace ancestry to medieval Europe carries genetic material that passed through the bodies of these forgotten mothers, women who survived long enough to reproduce, despite facing mortality rates that would terrify modern populations. Dr. Mitchell's team began to recognize patterns in how medieval mothers prepared for their own deaths while trying to protect their children's futures. Wills written by women often contained detailed instructions for child rearing that went far beyond legal necessities. Advice about which foods to avoid during illness, warnings about dangerous locations in the village, and even suggestions for finding new mothers among relatives or neighbors who could provide the love that death would steal. The cooking pots found in medieval kitchens told their own stories through chemical analysis that revealed the nutritional strategies mothers used to keep their families alive during famines. Residue from these vessels showed that women systematically gave themselves smaller portions while ensuring their children received adequate protein and vitamins, literally sacrificing their own health to improve their family's survival chances. Perhaps most remarkably, the research revealed how medieval mothers had created informal networks of mutual support that functioned like insurance policies against the constant threat of maternal mortality. Godmother relationships, wet nursing arrangements, and informal adoption practices created webs of obligation that ensured orphan children would be cared for by women who understood the sacred nature of maternal responsibility. As Dr. Mitchell stood in her laboratory surrounded by artifacts that represented 1,000 years of maternal love, she realized that her team had discovered something more significant than historical data. They had found proof that the fundamental human capacity for self-sacrificing love had remained constant across centuries of changing technology, religion, and social organization. The blood that had once flowed through these women's veins now flows through ours, carrying with it the genetic legacy of mothers who chose love over safety, sacrifice over survival, and hope over despair. Every heartbeat in our modern bodies echoes the hearts that beat in medieval breasts while carrying children, nursing babies, and whispering prayers over small graves. We are their living monuments, their victory over death, their proof that maternal love truly is stronger than time itself. In the darkness before dawn, when the desert air was cool and the stars burned with an intensity that modern city dwellers can barely imagine, a young shepherd named Nabu Ramani lay on his back watching the heavens and asking questions that would echo through human history. Above him, the night sky of ancient Babylon spread like a vast scroll covered with points of light, most of them fixed in their eternal patterns, but some, the wanderers, moving with mysterious purpose across the celestial dome. The year was approximately 2000 BCE, and humanity's relationship with the cosmos was still one of pure wonder mixed with practical necessity. Nabu Ramani, whose name meant Nabu is exalted, in honor of the Babylonian god of writing and wisdom, had been watching the sky since childhood while tending his family's sheep in the hills outside the great city. Unlike the priests and astronomers who observed the heavens from ziggurats and temple complexes, Nabu Ramani had the desert shepherd's advantage of perfect darkness and unlimited time. The ancient world possessed no light pollution, no atmospheric haze from industry, no urban glow to wash out the fainter stars. When night fell over Mesopotamia, it fell completely, revealing a sky so rich with detail that modern astronomers must travel to remote mountaintops to see anything comparable. The Milky Way stretched overhead like a river of light. Individual stars showed subtle color variations invisible to contemporary observers, and the planets, those wandering stars, traced their paths with a clarity that made their movements impossible to ignore. Nabu Ramani had begun to notice patterns in this celestial dance that went beyond the simple cycle of day and night. The wanderers, what we now call Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, didn't move randomly across the sky but followed predictable paths through specific groups of stars. Venus appeared as both morning and evening star, according to a complex schedule that repeated itself over time. Mars brightened and dimmed as it wandered through the zodiacal constellations, sometimes moving forward against the star background, sometimes appearing to move backward in mysterious loops. The questions that burned in the young shepherd's mind were the same ones that would drive human scientific inquiry for millennia. Why do some stars move while others remain fixed? What governs the wanderer's mysterious paths? Could these movements be predicted? And if so, what did that imply about the nature of the cosmos itself? In a world where divine will was thought to control everything from floods to famines, the apparent regularity of celestial motion suggested something profound about the relationship between earth and sky. Using nothing but his naked eyes and an increasingly sophisticated system of mental notation, Nabu Ramani began to track the wanderer's positions against the background stars. He developed his own terminology for the brightest constellations, creating mental maps that allowed him to describe planetary positions with surprising precision. When Venus reached the horn of the bull or Mars entered the house of the lion, he knew exactly what celestial coordinates these poetic descriptions represented. The practical applications of this astronomical knowledge quickly became apparent. The annual flooding of the Euphrates and Tigris rivers, essential for Mesopotamian agriculture, corresponded to specific stellar configurations. The best times for planting and harvesting could be determined by watching certain stars rise before dawn. Even the optimal timing for religious festivals and royal ceremonies seemed connected to celestial cycles that Nabu Ramani was learning to predict with increasing accuracy. But it was the eclipse predictions that transformed the young shepherd from curious observer into something approaching a local oracle. By carefully tracking the movements of the sun and moon against the star background, Nabu Ramani began to recognize the conditions that preceded solar and lunar eclipses. When he successfully predicted the darkening of the sun during what should have been midday, word of his achievement reached the priests and astronomers of Babylon itself. The intellectual community that emerged from this early astronomical work would eventually develop mathematical models of planetary motion, create the first star catalogs, and establish observational techniques that would influence Greek, Islamic, and medieval European astronomy. But it all began with a shepherd lying in the desert darkness, staring up at points of light that beckoned with mysteries too compelling to ignore. As Nabu Ramani rolled up his sleeping blanket at dawn and prepared to lead his flock to water, he carried with him the satisfaction of having glimpsed patterns in the apparent chaos of celestial motion. The light from those distant stars had traveled unimaginable distances to reach his eyes, carrying information about a universe far larger and more complex than anyone in his world could imagine. Hans Lippershey dropped the two lenses he had been holding and stared through the wooden tube he had just assembled, his mouth falling open as the church tower of Middelburg suddenly appeared close enough to touch. It was October 1608, and the Dutch spectacle maker had just accidentally created an invention that would change humanity's relationship with distance forever, though he had no idea that his simple spyglass would eventually unlock the secrets of the universe itself. The discovery happened in the cluttered workshop behind Hans's spectacle shop, where glass lenses in various stages of completion covered every available surface. As one of the most skilled lens grinders in the Dutch Republic, Hans made his living crafting reading glasses for aging scholars and merchants, carefully shaping pieces of glass to correct the failing vision that seemed to afflict anyone who lived past 40. It was precise, profitable work, but hardly the stuff of scientific revolution. The breakthrough came when Hans's young apprentice, John, was playing with discarded lens fragments while waiting for his master to finish a particularly difficult grinding job. Children in lens-making shops learned early not to touch the valuable finished products, but the broken pieces and failed experiments were fair game for idle curiosity. Jan had picked up two lenses of different focal lengths and was looking through them in sequence when he noticed something remarkable. Objects across the street appeared dramatically magnified. "Master Lippershey," Jan called excitedly, "come see what these lenses do when you look through both of them." Hans, accustomed to his apprentice's various discoveries and mishaps, approached with the weary patience of a man who had seen every possible way that glass could be broken, melted, or otherwise rendered useless. But when he looked through Jan's improvised combination, his irritation transformed into amazement. The effect was undeniable. Distant objects appeared not just larger but closer, as if the very fabric of space had been compressed. Hans quickly began experimenting with different lens combinations, mounting them in a wooden tube to maintain proper alignment and distance. The optimal configuration seemed to be a concave eyepiece lens combined with a convex objective lens, creating a simple but effective telescope that magnified objects by a factor of 3 or 4. Word of Hans's Dutch perspective glass spread through Middelburg with the speed that remarkable news travels in small communities. Within days, merchants were lining up outside his shop, eager to purchase devices that would give them crucial advantages in spotting incoming ships and their valuable cargoes. The military applications were equally obvious. A general who could observe enemy positions from a safe distance possessed information that could determine the outcome of battles. But Hans faced an immediate problem. He wasn't the only person experimenting with lens combinations. Zacharias Janssen, another spectacle maker in the same town, claimed to have independently developed a similar device. The question of who deserved credit for the invention became a matter of fierce local debate, with supporters of both men presenting evidence and testimony about who had achieved the breakthrough first. The Dutch government, recognizing the strategic importance of the new invention, summoned Hans to The Hague to demonstrate his telescope before Prince Maurice of Nassau and other high officials. The demonstration was a complete success. Observers marveled as they watched people walking on distant streets, read signs that had been invisible moments before, and examined architectural details on buildings miles away. The prince immediately grasped the military potential and attempted to purchase exclusive rights to the technology. However, Hans's application for a patent was ultimately rejected on the grounds that the device was too simple to qualify for legal protection. The patent office noted that any competent lens maker could reproduce the telescope after examining one example, making monopoly control impossible to enforce. This decision proved prophetic. Within months, similar devices were being manufactured across Europe by craftsmen who had either seen Hans's original or heard detailed descriptions of its construction. The rejection of his patent application meant that Hans never became wealthy from his invention, despite creating one of the most important optical instruments in human history. He continued making spectacles and occasional telescopes for local customers, while watching his simple tube and lens design spread across the continent like a benevolent infection, multiplying in workshops and inspiring improvements he never could have imagined. As Hans stood in his workshop on winter evenings, holding one of his telescopes and looking out at the lights of Middelburg, he sometimes wondered what other secrets might be revealed if someone pointed his invention toward the stars instead of merely toward distant earthly objects. The light from those celestial points seemed to beckon with possibilities that extended far beyond the practical concerns of merchants and generals, though Hans could never have predicted that his accidental discovery would eventually reveal moons around Jupiter and rings around Saturn. Galileo Galilei stood on the roof of his house in Padua on a cold January night in 1610, holding a telescope of his own construction and preparing to commit what the Catholic Church would later consider the most dangerous act of scientific heresy in human history. He had heard rumors about the Dutch spyglass and had quickly built an improved version with 20x magnification. But instead of pointing it at ships in Venice's harbor or enemy armies across distant fields, he was about to aim it at the moon and discover that the heavens were not the perfect, unchanging realm that Aristotelian philosophy and Christian theology demanded them to be. The telescope in Galileo's hands represented months of obsessive work improving upon Hans Lippershey's basic design. Where the Dutch model had provided only 3x magnification, Galileo's version could bring distant objects 20 times closer with remarkable clarity. He had ground his own lenses, experimenting with different glass compositions and curvatures until he achieved optics that surpassed anything available in Northern Europe. This wasn't just scientific curiosity. Galileo understood that superior technology could make him wealthy and famous if he played his cards correctly. When Galileo first turned his telescope toward the moon, he expected to see the smooth, luminous sphere that philosophers had described for centuries. A perfect celestial body that reflected divine light without blemish or variation. Instead, he found himself staring at what appeared to be another world entirely, complete with mountains, valleys, and craters that cast shadows across a landscape as rugged and complex as any terrestrial terrain. The moon wasn't a polished mirror, but a place with geography that changed as the angle of sunlight shifted during its monthly phases. The implications hit Galileo like a physical blow. If the moon had mountains and valleys, then the celestial realm was made of the same imperfect matter that comprised the earthly domain. The fundamental distinction between the heavenly and terrestrial spheres, a cornerstone of medieval cosmology, crumbled under the evidence visible through 20 inches of carefully ground glass. Galileo was looking at proof that the universe was far stranger and more unified than anyone had imagined. But the moon was only the beginning of revelations that would shake the foundations of human understanding. When Galileo pointed his telescope at Jupiter, he discovered something that made the lunar mountains seem almost mundane by comparison. 4 small stars that appeared to orbit the giant planet like tiny moons. Night after night, he watched these Medicean stars change positions in a predictable dance around Jupiter, providing visible proof that not everything in the universe revolved around Earth. The discovery of Jupiter's moons demolished one of the strongest arguments against the Copernican theory that placed the Sun at the center of the solar system. Critics of Copernicus had argued that if Earth moved around the Sun, our moon would be left behind. But here was Jupiter, clearly in motion through the zodiac, carrying its own family of satellites along for the journey. If Jupiter could have moons while orbiting the Sun, then so could Earth. Galileo's observations of Venus provided even more dramatic evidence for the heliocentric model. Through his telescope, he watched Venus go through a complete cycle of phases, from thin crescent to full disk and back again, exactly as Copernicus had predicted it would if both Earth and Venus orbited the Sun. In the old Earth-centered system, Venus should never have appeared as more than a crescent, but Galileo's eyes were witnessing the full cycle that proved Venus traveled around the Sun rather than around Earth. The Milky Way, that mysterious band of light that stretched across the night sky, resolved through Galileo's telescope into countless individual stars, so many that he gave up trying to count them. This discovery suggested that the universe was vastly larger than anyone had supposed, filled with stars so distant that they appeared as a continuous glow to naked-eye observers. The cosmos wasn't a small, tidy system with Earth at its center, but an almost incomprehensibly vast collection of suns scattered through infinite space. Galileo published his discoveries in Sidereus Nuncius, the Starry Messenger, in 1610, creating an immediate sensation throughout Europe. Scholars and nobles clamored to look through telescopes and see these wonders for themselves. But the Catholic Church, recognizing the threat that these observations posed to its authority over natural philosophy, began to mobilize against both Galileo and his instruments of revelation. As Galileo stood on his rooftop laboratory, surrounded by the tools that had transformed him from a mathematics professor into the most famous scientist in Europe, he understood that there was no going back. The light pouring through his telescope had illuminated truths that would reshape human understanding of our place in the cosmos, even if those truths came with a price, that might include his freedom, his reputation, and possibly his life. Edwin Hubble stepped into the observer's cage of the 100-inch Hooker telescope atop Mount Wilson, California, on a crisp October night in 1925, and prepared to make an observation that would shatter humanity's conception of the universe's size and structure. Below him stretched the lights of Los Angeles, still dim enough in that era to allow spectacular astronomical viewing, while above him the cosmos waited to reveal secrets that would make every previous astronomical discovery seem quaint by comparison. The year 1925 marked the height of what historians would later call the Great Debate in Astronomy, a fundamental disagreement about whether the spiral nebulae visible through large telescopes were distant collections of stars or merely gas clouds within our own Milky Way galaxy. Most astronomers, including some of the most respected names in the field, believe that our galaxy constituted the entire universe, and that everything else visible through telescopes existed within its boundaries. Hubble had been systematically photographing the Andromeda Nebula, that faint spiral smudge barely visible to naked-eye observers, using the most powerful telescope in the world. The Hooker telescope's 100-inch mirror could collect more light than any instrument previously built, revealing details in distant objects that had been invisible to earlier generations of astronomers. But what Hubble was looking for required more than just light-gathering power. It demanded the ability to resolve individual stars within what most people assumed was simply a diffuse cloud of glowing gas. The breakthrough came when Hubble identified what appeared to be a Cepheid variable star within the Andromeda Nebula, a type of star whose brightness pulsates in a predictable cycle that directly correlates with its intrinsic luminosity. Henrietta Swan Leavitt had discovered this relationship years earlier, creating a cosmic measuring stick that allowed astronomers to calculate distances to any Cepheid they could observe and time accurately. Night after night, Hubble photographed the same region of Andromeda, carefully measuring the brightness variations of his suspected Cepheid. The star dimmed and brightened with clockwork regularity, following the pattern that confirmed its identity and provided the data needed for distance calculation. When Hubble completed his mathematical analysis, the result was so staggering that he initially assumed he had made an error in his calculations. The Cepheid variable in Andromeda was approximately 900,000 light-years away, far beyond the boundaries of our galaxy, which astronomers estimated to be only 100,000 light-years in diameter. This meant that Andromeda wasn't a nebula within the Milky Way, but an entirely separate galaxy containing billions of stars, so distant that they merged into a faint spiral glow when viewed from Earth. The implications cascaded through Hubble's consciousness like falling dominoes. If Andromeda was a separate galaxy, then the other spiral nebulae scattered across the sky were probably galaxies as well. The universe wasn't a single island of stars surrounded by empty space, but a vast archipelago of galaxies stretching to unimaginable distances. Humanity had just discovered that we lived in one galaxy among countless millions, perhaps billions, scattered throughout a cosmos of almost incomprehensible scale. But Hubble's revelations were only beginning. As he continued his observations of distant galaxies, he noticed something even more extraordinary. The light from these galaxies was systematically shifted toward the red end of the spectrum, and the more distant the galaxy, the greater the redshift. This pattern suggested that galaxies were moving away from us, and more surprisingly, that the most distant galaxies were receding fastest. Working with his colleague Milton Humason, Hubble gathered spectroscopic data from dozens of galaxies and discovered what would become known as Hubble's law. The velocity at which galaxies recede is directly proportional to their distance from us. This relationship implied something that seemed almost impossible to accept. The universe itself was expanding, carrying galaxies apart like dots on an inflating balloon. The expanding universe model solved several puzzling problems in astronomy and cosmology, but it also raised questions that challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of existence itself. If the universe was expanding now, then it must have been smaller in the past. Extrapolating backward suggested that all matter and energy in the cosmos had once been concentrated in an unimaginably dense state, what would later be called the Big Bang. As Hubble climbed down from the observer's cage after another night of galaxy hunting, he carried with him data that would revolutionize human understanding of our place in the cosmos. The light that had traveled millions of years to reach his photographic plates told a story of expansion, evolution, and almost infinite scale that dwarfed every previous conception of universal structure. Standing on the mountaintop as dawn approached, Hubble looked out over the sleeping city below and up at the fading stars above, knowing that he had witnessed the universe revealing its greatest secret. The steady, pure light that had guided his observations through the night came not from a small, static cosmos centered on humanity, but from an expanding universe filled with galaxies beyond counting. Each one a collection of billions of stars scattered across distances that made the human imagination reel with vertigo and wonder. And there you have it. From Autumn's cosmic solo performance to eternal bedroom privileges in the afterlife, the ancient Egyptians proved that sexuality wasn't something to whisper about behind closed doors, but something to celebrate, sanctify, and plan for across multiple lifetimes. They understood that the force that creates universes is the same force that creates intimate connection between two people sharing lettuce by the Nile. Tonight's journey through ancient Egyptian bedrooms is just the beginning. Over the next few episodes, we'll explore how this refreshingly honest approach to human desire shaped everything from their art to their architecture, their medicine to their mythology. We'll discover why Cleopatra's seduction techniques were actually based on thousand-year-old temple practices, and how Egyptian contraception methods were surprisingly effective and occasionally terrifying. If you found yourself questioning why we've made sexuality so complicated when the Egyptians kept it so beautifully simple, then you're going to love where this series takes us next. Each episode reveals another layer of how one of history's greatest civilizations integrated physical pleasure with spiritual meaning in ways that might just change how you think about both. Hit that like button if ancient Egyptian wisdom made you reconsider modern hang-ups, and subscribe for more stories that prove history's most fascinating secrets often hide in the places we're least comfortable looking. Sweet dreams, and remember, somewhere in the field of reeds, eternal couples are still enjoying the fruits of their earthly honesty.